I'm Tracy. Today's story is Good Work, Amelia, Bedelia. Amelia, Bedelia, called Mr. Rogers. Is the coffee ready? Coming right up, said Amelia, Bedelia. She poured a cup of coffee. She took it into the dining room. There, said Amelia, Bedelia. Would you like something more? Yes, said Mr. Rogers. Toast and an egg. Fine, said Amelia, Bedelia. She went into the kitchen. Very quickly, Amelia, Bedelia was back. Mr. Rogers picked up the egg. He broke it over his toast. Confound it, Amelia, Bedelia, he said. I didn't say raw egg. Confound it. 이런 망할, 이런 나쁜 말입니다. 날 계란을 가져와 버렸네요. 어떡하죠? But you didn't say to cook it, said Amelia, Bedelia. 그런데 익혀오라는 말씀은 안 하셨잖아요. 이렇게 말하네요. 어떡해. Mr. Rogers threw down his napkin. Oh, go fly a kite, he said. Amelia, Bedelia looked surprised. All right, she said. If you say so. 어쩌나요? Fly a kite라는 말은 가서 네 볼일을 보세요. 꺼지세요. 이런 뜻인데 진짜 fly a kite를 하러 가는 건 아니겠죠? Soon Amelia Bedelia was out in a field. She had a kite. Now that was nice of Mr. Rogers, she said. I do love to fly kites. But I better get back. Mrs. Rogers might need me. Sure enough, Mrs. Rogers was calling. Amelia, Bedelia. Here I am, said Amelia, Bedelia. There's a lot to do, said Mrs. Rogers. Do you know how to make bread? I make good cornbread, said Amelia, Bedelia. No, I want white bread, said Mrs. Rogers. You are a good cook. Just do what the recipe says. All right, said Amelia, Bedelia. Here's a list of the other things I want you to do, said Mrs. Rogers. I'll be out until dinner time. Don't worry, said Amelia, Bedelia. I'll get everything done. Mrs. Rogers left. I'll start with that bread, said Amelia, Bedelia. She read the recipe. Do tell, she said. I never knew bread did magic things. Amelia, Bedelia got everything she needed. Quickly, she mixed the dough. Amelia, Bedelia set the pan on the table. Now, she said, you're supposed to rise. This I've got to see. Amelia, Bedelia sat down to watch, but nothing happened. Maybe you don't like to be watched. I'll come back, said Amelia, Bedelia. 이게 부풀어 오른다는 뜻의 rise인데 아멜리아 베델리는 이게 뜬다고 생각했나 한 것 같아요. 그래서 언제 뜨지? 이렇게 생각하는 거예요. Let's see. Amelia Bedelia got her list. Clean out the ashes in the parlor fireplace. Fill the wood box. Amelia Bedelia went into the parlor. She cleaned out the ashes, and Amelia Bedelia filled the wood box. 이런 재를 다 깨끗하게 치우라는 뜻인데 이 ash를 여기 wood box에 채워버렸어요. That's done, said Amelia Bedelia. What's next? She read. Pot the window box plants. Put the pots in the parlor. Amelia Bedelia went outside. She counted the plants. Then she went into the kitchen. My goodness, she said. I need every pot for this. So she took them all. Amelia Bedelia potted those plants and she took them inside. 원래 팟은 화분이라는 뜻이 있는데 진짜 냄비 팟을 가져와 버렸어요. 큰일 났네요. Now I better tend to that bread, said Amelia Bedelia. She went into the kitchen, but the bread still sat on the table. Now look here, she said. You're supposed to rise. Then I'm supposed to punch you down. How can I punch if you don't rise? Amelia Bedelia sat down to think. Maybe that pan is too heavy. She said, I better help it rise. 이걸 뜨게 만들려나 봐요. 오, 이런. Amelia Bedelia got some string. She worked for a bit, and that bread began to rise. That should be high enough, said Amelia Bedelia. I'll just let you stay there a while. 이 정도면 충분히 뜬 거겠지? 이러는 거예요. Amelia Bedelia picked up her list. Make a spongy cake. Amelia Bedelia read that again. I know a lot about cakes, she said, and I never heard of that. But if she wants a sponge cake, I'll make her a spongy cake. Amelia Bedelia put a little of this and some of that into a bowl. She mixed and mixed. Now for the sponge, she said. Amelia Bedelia got a sponge. She snipped it into small pieces. There, she said. Into the cake you go. 진짜 스펀지를 넣었어. 어떡해. Soon the sponge cake was baking. I don't think Mr. Rogers will like this cake, said Amelia Bedelia. I will make my kind of cake too. He does love butterscotch icing. So Amelia Bedelia baked another cake. There now, she said. I'll surprise him. Amelia Bedelia put the butterscotch cake in the cupboard. She put the sponge cake on the shelf. My, this is a busy day, said Amelia Bedelia. Let's see what's next. Call Alcalu, ask him to patch the front door screen. Amelia Bedelia shook her head. Alcalu can't patch anything, she said. I better do that myself. She got what she needed. 이게 front screen door에 구멍 난 부분 수선해달라는 건데 이거를 천조각으로 땜빵질을 해버렸어요. 어떡하죠? And Amelia Bedelia patched that screen. Amelia Bedelia looked at the time. Oh, she said, I'd better get dinner started. Let me see what she wants. She read the list. A chicken dinner will be fine. Amelia Bedelia shook her head. Well, what will she think of next? She said. Well, that won't take long to fix. Amelia Bedelia got everything ready. She set the table. Then she sat down to rest. Soon Mr. and Mrs. Rogers came home. Amelia Bedelia, yelled Mr. Rogers. Coming, called Amelia Bedelia. What is that awful cloth on the front door? Asked Mrs. Rogers. You said to patch the screen, said Amelia Bedelia. Can't patch without a patch. They went into the parlor. Oh, my good pots, said Mrs. Rogers. And bad ones, too, said Amelia Bedelia. Mr. Rogers looked at the wood box. He shook his head, but he didn't say a word. They went into the kitchen. The sponge cake is pretty, said Mrs. Rogers. At least it's done right. Something caught Mr. Rogers' eye. He looked up. What in tarnation is that? He said. The bread, said Amelia Bedelia. I plumb forgot it. Do let me punch it down quick. plumb forgot it 하면 완전 잊었네요. What in tarnation이라고 했죠. What in tarnation is that? 도대체 저건 뭐야? 이렇게 말을 하는 거예요. She climbed up on a chair. Amelia Bedelia began to punch. Mr. and Mrs. Rogers just stared. The bread plopped to the floor. Did I see what I thought I saw? Said Mr. Rogers. You did, said Mrs. Rogers. Now, said Amelia Bedelia, dinner is ready when you are. Well, you can cook, said Mrs. Rogers. Dinner should be good. I hope so, said Mr. Rogers. I'm hungry. Just serve the plates, said Mrs. Rogers. Mr. and Mrs. Rogers sat at the table. Amelia Bedelia brought in the plates. Mr. and Mrs. Rogers stared at the plates. But that's cracked corn. It's all kinds of awful things, said Mrs. Rogers. You said chicken dinner, said Amelia Bedelia. That's what chickens eat for dinner. Mrs. Rogers was too angry to speak. 치킨 디너를 해달라고 했는데 치킨이 먹는 디너를 준비했대요. 어쩌요? Mrs. Rogers was too angry to speak. Take this mess away, said Mr. Rogers. Mrs. Rogers said, serve the cake and coffee. Amelia Bedelia did. Mr. Rogers took a big bite of cake. He spluttered and spit it out. What in tarnation is in that? He said. Sponge, said Amelia Bedelia. Mrs. Rogers said to make a sponge cake. 진짜 스펀지를 넣었어요. Suddenly Mr. Rogers laughed. He lowered. Mrs. Rogers looked at the lumpy cake. Then she laughed too. But I'm still hungry, said Mr. Rogers. I can fix that, said Amelia Bedelia. I have a surprise for you. Oh no, said Mr. Rogers. I can't stand another one, said Mrs. Rogers. Amelia Bedelia brought in milk and her butterscotch cake. Oh, said Mr. Rogers. Hurry, said Mrs. Rogers. Give me some. Soon the whole cake was gone. How do you do it, Amelia Bedelia? said Mr. Rogers. 1 minute we were hopping mad at you, and the next we know we can't do without you, said Mrs. Rogers. Amelia Bedelia smiled. I guess I just understand your ways, she said.